There are certain stories that stick with you not because of the drama or the spectacle, but because they peel back the layers of a human being right there on stage, exposing a truth so raw and so fundamental that it changes the energy in the entire room. You see, after thousands of shows, you develop a certain instinct. You can feel the difference between genuine pain and a well-rehearsed performance. You learn to spot the narrative a person has built around themselves, a fortress of excuses and blame that protects them from the terrifying reality of their own accountability. This was one of those stories. It was the story of a young woman I'll call Amanda. When her case file first landed on my desk, it read like 100 others. A life in shambles, a family at their breaking point. Amanda, 28 years old, was the self-proclaimed victim of a cruel and unjust world. The labels attached to her by her family were stark, manipulative, lazy, a professional victim. According to her mother and older sister, who were the ones who wrote to me, she couldn't hold a job, her relationships were a revolving door of drama and heartbreak, and she blamed every single failure on someone else. Her boss was a tyrant, her landlord was unreasonable, her ex-boyfriend was a narcissist, her family just didn't understand her. The common denominator in this long equation of misery was, in her eyes, everyone but her. My initial impression, just from reading the preliminary interviews and the frantic emails from her sister, was that we were dealing with a classic case of what I call a secondary gain. The behavior itself, the failure, the drama, the constant crisis was negative, but it was producing a payoff. It was getting her attention, it was absolving her of responsibility, and it was allowing her to avoid the terrifying prospect of actually having to step up and live her life. But a diagnosis from a distance is just a hypothesis. The real work happens when you look someone in the eye. When I met Amanda backstage before the show, she presented exactly as I'd expected. There was a fragility to her, a practiced vulnerability that she wore like a second skin. Her eyes were wide, her voice was soft, and her story was filled with injustices. She spoke of her childhood as a time of being overlooked in favor of her perfect older sister. She described a mother who was critical and a father who was emotionally distant. In her telling, she was a tender soul navigating a world too harsh for her. And you know what? I believe a part of that was true. I never discount a person's history. Our past is the architect of our present. The problem isn't the history. The problem is when you use that history as a permanent hall pass for a dysfunctional present. I listened. I always listen. I let her build her case piece by piece. I wanted to understand the world as she saw it, to walk around in her narrative. She was compelling. If you didn't know how to look for the cracks, you'd believe her 100%. You'd see a victim. But I wasn't looking at the story she was telling. I was looking at the function that story served. Her victimhood wasn't just a feeling, it was a strategy, a full-time job. And the salary was a life free from the weight of expectation and the risk of failure. If you're always the one being wronged, then you never have to be the one who is wrong. You never have to do the hard work of looking in the mirror and saying, "This is on me. I need to change." That is a terrifying proposition for someone who has spent nearly 3 decades perfecting the art of the excuse. The stage was set not for a fight, but for a confrontation with the truth. My goal wasn't to tear her down, but to tear down the fictional world she had built around herself, a world that was in reality a prison of her own making. We walked out onto the stage, and the energy shifted just as it always does. The lights come up, the audience is there, and suddenly everything is real. On the couch across from me sat Carol the mother and Jessica the sister. The story they told painted a picture of 2 people at the end of their rope. Carol was a woman worn down to a nub. You could see the years of worry etched around her eyes. She spoke in a low, tired voice, a litany of Amanda's failed jobs, unpaid bills she'd covered, and dramatic late-night phone calls. There was love there, but it was buried under layers of exhaustion and resentment. She was a classic enabler, not out of malice, but out of a misguided sense of parental duty. She kept swooping in to save Amanda, and in doing so, she was robbing her of the very consequences that could have been her greatest teachers. Every time Carol paid a bill or made an excuse for Amanda, she was sending a clear message: you are not capable, you need me to survive. Jessica, the older sister, was a different story entirely. She was fire to her mother's weary earth. Anger radiated off her. She was the responsible one, the one who had her life together, and she was furious at having to be a part of this recurring family drama. In her eyes, Amanda wasn't fragile. She was a parasite draining their mother emotionally and financially. Jessica's frustration was valid, but her delivery was laced with a lifetime of resentment. As she spoke, she'd point a finger, her voice sharp with accusation. She does this on purpose. She knows Mom will bail her out. It's been the same story since we were kids. And right there, that was the key. Since we were kids, this wasn't a new problem. This was a deeply ingrained family system, a dance they had all perfected over decades. As I watched them, I saw the roles they had all been assigned. Jessica was the hero child. She succeeded, she achieved, she made her parents proud. She was the proof that their parenting had worked. Amanda, in turn, became the scapegoat or the problem child. When you have a hero, you often need a counterpart. She carried the family's dysfunction. Her failures became the focal point, the distraction from any other issues that might be simmering beneath the surface, like a strained marriage or the father's emotional absence. It's a lot easier to rally around solving Amanda's latest crisis than it is to look at the cracks in the foundation of the entire family. I turned my attention back to Amanda. While her mother and sister spoke, she was putting on a masterclass in nonverbal communication. She didn't have to say a word. She slumped in her chair, making herself look smaller, more vulnerable. A single perfect tear would roll down her cheek at just the right moment. She'd shake her head slowly, a silent protest of "you just don't understand." It was a performance designed to elicit sympathy and to paint her family as the aggressors. She was the wounded bird, and they were the cruel ones throwing stones. But I knew this story started long before she was 28. I asked Carol about Amanda's childhood. At first, she was defensive. She was a happy child. A little sensitive, maybe. That word sensitive, that's often the label we give to kids who are expressing a need the family doesn't know how to meet. I probed deeper. I asked about the dynamic between the two sisters. The story that emerged was one of unconscious comparison. Jessica's report cards were on the fridge. Her soccer trophies were on the mantle. Amanda was quieter, more artistic, less competitive. Her achievements weren't as loud, not as easily measured. So how does a child who feels invisible get seen? Sometimes they discover that a crisis gets a faster response than a crayon drawing. A skinned knee gets more attention than an A-. A failure commands the full and undivided attention of a parent in a way that quiet competence never will. And the emotionally distant father, his attention was the ultimate prize. I guarantee you, when Amanda was in the emergency room for a panic attack or calling home because she'd been fired again, he was on the phone. He was engaged. She had found the button. Negative attention had become a functional substitute for the genuine connection she craved. She learned a devastating equation: trouble equals presence, pain equals love. And that lesson learned in childhood was now the operating system for her entire adult life. The dynamic was so clear it was practically written on a teleprompter in my head. You had an emotionally absent father, which created a vacuum. The mother, Carol, overcompensated by becoming hyper-involved trying to be both parents. Her currency became caretaking. Jessica, seeing that achievement and independence earned her a measure of praise and less of the suffocating, anxious help her mother offered, doubled down on being the perfect daughter. And Amanda learned that the most potent way to command her mother's full attention and even get a flicker of engagement from her father was to be in crisis. It was a perfectly dysfunctionally balanced system. Each person was playing their part to get their needs met, however unhealthy the method. This system chugged along for years. Amanda would move out, get a job, and for a while things would seem normal. But the pattern was always lurking just beneath the surface. The first sign of real-world pressure, a critical boss, a conflict with a roommate, a boyfriend who demanded accountability, and the whole structure would come crashing down. A job would be lost, rent would be late, and the frantic call home would be made. Carol would swoop in with money and soothing words. Jessica would find out and explode with righteous anger. The family drama would play out over the phone lines for a few weeks until the immediate crisis was solved and the cycle would reset. The escalation, the thing that finally broke this feedback loop and landed them on my stage, happened about 6 months before they wrote to me. Amanda had landed what she called her dream job as an administrative assistant at a design firm. By all accounts, it was a great opportunity. For about 2 months, the news was all positive. She was loving it, she was good at it, her boss was so supportive. The family breathed a collective sigh of relief. This was it. This was the time she was finally going to make it. But then the old language started to creep back in. The supportive boss became micromanaging, her coworkers were cliquey and out to get her. Minor feedback was interpreted as a personal attack. She started calling in sick. 2 weeks later, she was fired. But this time was different. This time she wasn't just fired from a job, she lost her apartment as a result. She had nowhere to go, so she moved back home. And when you take a dysfunctional system that has been operating at a distance and put it all under one roof, you have a pressure cooker. The theoretical became the real. The nightly phone calls became face-to-face confrontations in the kitchen. The blame, which had previously been directed at a rotating cast of outside characters, was now aimed squarely at Carol and Jessica. Everything became their fault. If you had been more supportive when I was growing up, Mom, I'd have more confidence, she'd yell. Or to Jessica, it must be nice to have had everything handed to you. You were always the favorite, so you have no idea what it's like to struggle. She was a master at using their shared history as a weapon. She would cherry-pick memories, twisting them into evidence for her grand thesis of a life wronged. She used guilt the way a surgeon uses a scalpel cutting with precision to hit every insecurity her mother and sister had. For Carol, the enabling became an around-the-clock job. She'd make Amanda's breakfast, listen to her circular complaints for hours, and walk on eggshells to avoid triggering her. But her rescue attempts were now met with scorn. Nothing she did was right. She was caught in a classic double bind. If she helped, she was controlling, and if she didn't, she was unsupportive. Jessica watched this all with a fury that was reaching a boiling point. She'd come over for dinner to find Amanda on the couch watching TV while her mother cleaned up around her. The injustice of it was eating her alive. She was working 60 hours a week, paying her own mortgage, and here was her sister living rent-free, contributing nothing, and emotionally torturing their mother. The arguments between the sisters became explosive. They weren't just fights about the present, they were relitigating their entire childhood. Every perceived slight, every moment of jealousy, every ounce of resentment came pouring out. It was a family imploding. And that's when Carol, in a moment of sheer desperation, sat down and wrote to me. She didn't know what else to do. She knew she was part of the problem, but she couldn't see the way out. She was drowning, and she was taking the whole family down with her. They didn't come to the show for fame. They came because their house was on fire, and they had forgotten how to find the door. When they were all on stage, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I had listened to the backstory, I had observed the dynamic, and now it was time to move from diagnosis to intervention. The audience could feel it too. There's a moment in these conversations where the history lesson ends and the work begins. I looked directly at Amanda. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. All the stories, all the accusations, all the tears, they were all pieces of a puzzle, but they were pieces of the wrong puzzle. She was trying to assemble a picture of her victimhood, and my job was to show her she had the wrong box top. Amanda, I said, my voice calm but firm, I've heard you. I've heard you say your mother is critical, your sister is a bully, and the world has been unfair to you. I've heard you say you're a victim. She nodded, her eyes welling up on cue. Because it's true. Okay, I said, let's assume for a minute that everything you're saying is 100% true. Let's say your mother was too critical, your sister got all the attention, and every boss you've ever had was a jerk. "What's your payoff for being the victim?" She just stared at me confused. That question wasn't in her script. The word payoff short-circuited the narrative she had so carefully constructed. In her mind, there was no payoff, only pain. "What do you mean payoff?" she asked, a flicker of defiance in her voice. "There's no payoff. It's horrible. My life is a mess." Is it I countered, or is it a mess that works for you? Behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated. You're 28 years old, Amanda. This isn't just a bad week or a bad month. This is the operating system of your life. It has to be serving you in some way or you wouldn't keep doing it. So I'm going to ask you again, what are you getting out of this? What is the secondary gain for being the helpless, fragile victim of your life story? The air went out of her. The audience was dead silent. Her mother and sister were leaning forward, hanging on every word. This was the moment of confrontation. This was where the rubber meets the road. I wasn't attacking her. I was attacking the fiction. She stammered, I don't get anything." "Oh, I think you do," I said, not letting up. "Let's list them. Number one, you don't have to be responsible. If it's always someone else's fault, you never have to be accountable. You get to blame your mother's criticism for your lack of confidence instead of doing the hard work to build it yourself. That's a pretty big payoff. Accountability is heavy. You figured out how to never carry it. Number two, you don't have to risk failure. You quit jobs before you can be judged. You sabotage relationships before you can be rejected. You've created a life of almost and what ifs. You live in a permanent state of unrealized potential, which is a very safe place to be because you never have to put your skills to the test. If you don't truly try, you can't truly fail." Her face was starting to crumble. This wasn't anger or sadness. This was the dawning, terrifying recognition of a truth she had spent her life running from. "And number three," I said, lowering my voice slightly, and this is the big one, Amanda, "it gets you attention. It makes you the center of the universe. When you're in a crisis, your mother stops whatever she's doing and focuses entirely on you. Your father, who you say was never there, gets on the phone. Your sister, for all her anger, is engaged with you. This drama is the currency of connection in your family. You've learned that being a problem is the only way to feel like you're a priority." Tears were streaming down her face now, but these were different tears. They weren't for show, they were real. The well-rehearsed mask of the victim was cracking, and for the first time, I was seeing the scared, insecure person underneath. But she wasn't ready to give up the fight. It's the most predictable stage, the resistance. The ego will fight to the death to protect the narrative it has created. "That's not true," she said, her voice rising. "You're twisting everything. You're just like them. You're attacking me." And that's when I knew we were on the verge of a breakthrough. The accusation was the last gasp of the old strategy. Her brain was doing what it had always done when confronted with an uncomfortable truth: label the source as an attacker and retreat into the safety of victimhood. I held her gaze. I didn't flinch. "I am not attacking you, Amanda. I am attacking the story that is strangling the life out of you. I'm attacking the story that has you, a grown woman of 28, living like a child, completely dependent on others and miserable in the process. The story is your enemy, not me. You're in a prison and you're holding the key, but you keep telling everyone that the guard won't let you out." The audience was completely with me. You could feel the collective understanding. Many of them saw their own families, their own excuses reflected in this raw, exposed moment. Carol and Jessica were both crying softly, not out of anger or frustration anymore, but out of a shared, painful recognition of the truth. They saw their roles in the dance with a clarity they never had before. Amanda was still shaking her head, but the conviction was gone. It was a reflex now, not a belief. "But they did hurt me," she whispered. It was a plea for me not to erase her history, not to invalidate the real pain she had felt as a child who felt overlooked. I have no doubt that they did. I said, and this is the critical part, You cannot strip someone of their narrative without acknowledging the legitimacy of the feelings that created it. I have no doubt that there were times you felt invisible. I have no doubt that you craved more attention from your father. Those feelings are 100% valid. Your history is real, but your history is an explanation. It is not an excuse. You are using the facts of your childhood to justify the fiction of your adulthood. You are a 28-year-old woman. What happened to you at age 8 is a reason, but it is not a life sentence. The only person sentencing you to this life right now today is you. Silence. She looked down at her hands in her lap, her whole body seeming to deflate. The fight was over. The resistance had broken. In that moment, she wasn't a performer on a stage anymore. She was just a woman, stripped bare of all her defenses, staring into the abyss of her own accountability. And it was terrifying. Then I delivered the one question that I knew would either cement the breakthrough or send her running back to the safety of her victimhood. It was the question that her entire life had been constructed to avoid. I have one question for you, Amanda. I said, my voice quiet and direct, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Forget about what your mother did or didn't do. Forget about your sister. Forget about all the bad bosses and the boyfriends. Let's talk about you. What has been your role in creating the life you have today? It was a simple question, but it was also the most profound question she had ever been asked. It was a direct challenge to the core of her identity. I wasn't asking what was done to her. I was asking what she had done. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and revelation. For a full 30 seconds, she said nothing. You could almost see the gears turning in her mind, a lifetime of programming being challenged and rewritten in real time. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then took a deep, shuddering breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, raw and broken. Everything she said, it's been all me. And with those 4 words, the entire foundation of her life, the entire fortress of blame she had built, crumbled to dust. It was the single most courageous moment of her life. It's easy to blame. It's easy to point fingers. It's the hardest thing in the world to look at the wreckage of your own life and say, I did this. That's not a moment of shame. It's a moment of incredible power. Because the second you claim ownership of the problem, you also claim ownership of the solution. As long as it was everyone else's fault, she was powerless to change it. But if she was the architect of her own misery, then she could also be the architect of her own future. It was the breakthrough. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, devastating, and in the end, incredibly hopeful. The work wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time, Amanda was standing at the right starting line. That moment of confession, as powerful as it was, is never the end of the story. It's the beginning of the real work. A breakthrough on stage is like a lightning strike. It illuminates the entire landscape for a moment, showing you exactly where you are, but then the darkness returns and you have to learn how to navigate that landscape on your own, step by step. The outcome of a story like Amanda's is never guaranteed. The pull of old habits, the comfort of a familiar narrative is incredibly strong. My focus immediately shifted from confrontation to construction. We had demolished the old rotten structure. Now we had to start laying a new foundation. I turned to Carol and Jessica. And what has been your role in this? I asked them because this was never just about Amanda. She was the identified patient, but the whole family system was sick. Carol looked at me, her face streaked with tears. I thought I was helping, she said. I was just trying to be a good mother. I couldn't bear to see her in pain. I know you thought you were helping, Carol, I said gently, but you weren't. You were teaching her that she was incompetent. You were teaching her that she didn't have to face the consequences of her actions. Your help was crippling her. It was meeting your need to be needed, not her need to grow up. You have to learn to love her enough to let her fail. You have to be willing to watch her struggle, and you have to have enough faith in her that she can handle it. Your job is not to rescue her from life. Your job is to prepare her for it. And that job is 20 years overdue. Then I looked at Jessica. And you, I said, your anger is justified, but it's not helpful. You've been the scorekeeper in this family. Every time you throw her past in her face, every time you say, I told you so, you reinforce her belief that she's the screw-up, the designated failure. It gives her another excuse. You've been playing your role perfectly, the righteous, angry, successful sister. It makes you feel superior, but it keeps her stuck right where she is. You have to decide if you want to be right or if you want to have a relationship with your sister. This is the hardest part for families. They have to recognize that their own behaviors, often born from love or frustration, are the very things fueling the fire they're trying to put out. It requires a complete rewiring of their interactions. For Carol, it meant learning to say no. It meant learning to sit with her own anxiety when Amanda was struggling instead of immediately rushing in to fix it. For Jessica, it meant offering support without judgment and backing off from the role of the family prosecutor. For Amanda, the path forward was about action. Insight without action is just a parlor game. We laid out a concrete plan. Step one was getting a job, any job. It didn't have to be her dream job. It had to be a job that paid the bills. The point wasn't the title. The point was re-engaging with the world of responsibility, of showing up on time, of being accountable to someone other than herself. Step two was therapy. She needed a professional to help her unpack the decades of faulty thinking and to develop coping mechanisms that didn't involve manufacturing a crisis. She needed to build a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on external validation or attention. Step three was financial independence. Carol and I agreed on a hard timeline. Amanda had 60 days to find a job and start contributing to the household. After that, she would have a clear written plan to move out. There would be no more bailouts, no more loans that were never repaid. This wasn't about punishment, it was about dignity. The greatest gift they could give her was the belief that she was capable of standing on her own 2 feet. The show ended, and as is often the case, the real world began. We provided them with resources, connected them with therapists in their hometown, and scheduled follow-up calls. The first few weeks were rocky. Amanda went on a few interviews and was rejected. The old voice of the victim started whispering in her ear, "See, it's hopeless. The world is against you." She called her mother hysterical, and for the first time in her life, Carol didn't offer to fix it. She listened. She said, "I'm sorry that happened, honey. That sounds really tough. What's your plan for tomorrow?" It was probably the hardest sentence she ever had to say, but it was also the most loving. Amanda did get a job. It was working retail, a far cry from the design firm. There were days she wanted to quit. She'd come home and complain about her boss, her co-workers, the customers, and her family following the plan would listen, validate her feelings, and then gently redirect her to her own agency. That sounds frustrating. How are you going to handle that? The focus was always on her power, her choice. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first, things began to change. Getting a paycheck that she earned, paying a bill that she was responsible for, these small acts of self-sufficiency began to build a new identity. She was no longer just the victim. She was a woman who worked, who contributed, who handled her own problems. She and Jessica started having tentative conversations that weren't about the past, but about the present. Jessica saw her sister showing up, trying, and the anger began to soften into a cautious respect. I checked in with them about a year later. Amanda was still at the retail job, and she'd been promoted to a shift supervisor. She had moved into a small apartment with a roommate. She was still in therapy. She told me it was the hardest year of her life. She said she still had days where she wanted to burn it all down and run back to the familiar comfort of being the victim, but she didn't. She had tasted the quiet dignity of self-reliance, and it was more satisfying than any drama she had ever created. Her story is not a fairy tale. There was no magic wand. It was a brutal, inch-by-inch crawl out of a hole she had dug for herself. The outcome wasn't a perfect life. The outcome was a real life. A life with real struggles and real responsibilities, but also with real triumphs and genuine self-respect. She didn't stop being a victim because I told her to. She stopped being a victim when she realized that the price of that role was her entire life. She traded the hollow payoff of being taken care of for the profound reward of taking care of herself. And that, in the end, is a choice that defines an entire existence.